To finish off our area talk about customization, let's talk a little bit more about file properties. Now, we have two different types of file properties. We have our custom properties, which is where we entered our part number, and these are great areas for you to do things like add material, add information about the weight of the finish, because these properties can be linked to various things when you start creating drawings or assemblies, or even adding them later on into other areas such as design tables and so on. So this is a great way that you can add information that's attached to the file that you're dealing with. But what I really want to focus on are the properties associated with SolidWorks. There are a few things that we want to be concerned with in here. First of which is in the general section. There are a lot of things that are on by default, and they may or may not cause you some issues down the road. So one thing that's been added to SolidWorks in the past couple years is the freeze bar. Now this is a bar that you can drag down in the feature tree to lock features from rebuilding. Now you can turn this on or off if you want to use it, and we'll talk about it later on when we start creating some things and talking about different ways that we can fix errors in our files. But for right now, I'm going to leave it off. Some other things down in the bottom, you'll notice that it says show latest news feed in task pane. If you don't really want to see this information, you can turn this off so that way it's not always populating newsfeed with the latest information. But it can be very handy to have things like when the next release of SolidWorks is coming out, or certain topics in the forums that might pop up, and so on. Make sure that you take a look at some of these properties and figure out if you want to turn them on or off. Things like Feature Expert can be annoying if you're constantly importing files that you don't want to use Feature Expert on, and so on. The colors section. Now, if you want to modify the overall appearance or the theme, you can do that directly in here. And there are a few ones that we can do. Light as a default. You'll notice that medium and dark are experimental. I'm currently using SolidWorks 2016 pre-release because Service Pack 0 is not out yet. So some of this stuff might change when the final release is out. But there are different color schemes that you can select, and they'll change things like the way things are highlighted or so on. Now, of course, you can select these, or you can use the defaults, delete them at any point in time, or make custom ones, and so on. I want to go into the sketch section. Now, inside the sketch section, there are things like auto rotate view normal to sketch plane on sketch creation. Very handy, saves you a lot of time from having to automatically change the view. Use fully defined sketches. This is very important, but a lot of times I leave this off because when you create complex parts, especially when using lots of splines, it's a good idea to leave them underdefined while you're trying to get the shape just right. So I don't like to turn this on unless I absolutely have to, and I'm not making custom stuff. As we go down, you can see that we can display arc center points and parts assembly sketches. Very handy to leave this on, but sometimes depending on your sketches, it can be a lot to look at. So you might want to turn these off. Create sketch on new part. This, when you start a brand new part, it'll automatically prompt you for a plane, and then you'll start creating a new sketch right away. If you like that option, it can save you a few clicks. Go ahead and turn that on. Override dimensions on drag move. Not a very good option to turn on, especially for a new user, because you can drag the parts and override any dimensions it added. Display plane when shaded. So this is an option that you can turn on if you like to see your planes. By default, I always hide my planes. I never like to view them, but a lot of people do, so sometimes you might want to turn that option on. Line length measured between virtual sharps in 3D. Leave this on by default. Leave enable spline tangency and curvature handles on by default. And you can automatically show spline control polygon by default if you want. Ghost image on drag, very handy. And show curvature comb bounding curve. So again, another handy option here. Thing that I really want to make sure that you turn on, because it's going to be very handy moving forward in the series, is enable on-screen numeric input on entity creation and create dimensions only when value is entered. Now we're going to hop out of here and I'm going to show you what that means after we're done, but just want to make sure that you do turn these two options on. The rest are all going to be up to you, but I want to make sure that these two are on. Now, as we go down, there are some other options in here, such as spin box increments. By default, when you start a new feature, it's going to automatically put in 0.1 inches or 10 millimeters as the base unit by default. So this can be handy to change. Things like view. If you want to reverse the mouse zoom wheel direction, a lot of people are used to it being opposite than what it is. Or if you want to modify things like how fast your mouse is moving and so on. Those are all located in here. As we go down, there are things like messages and errors and warnings. There are some options for collaboration if you're using a multi-user environment. We are not going to be worrying about that. It's a little bit more advanced topic. And again, there are lots of different options in here. We're not going to touch on all of these. but it might be a good idea to just manually go through them. And as I talked about when we were creating our templates, there is a document properties section that has a lot of good things inside of it, such as image quality, properties for specific things like sheet metal or weldments. And when we get to those sections, we'll talk about these options a little bit because SolidWorks has a little bit of a habit of putting stuff in here, which are great features, and they omit to turn them on by default. So we're going to come in and we're going to talk about these when we actually need to use them. But let's take a second to talk about the sketch option that I did turn on. So we're going to start a new sketch, and you'll notice that when I did that, it automatically went normal to that view. So now when I start creating something like a line, the dimension is displayed on the left-hand side, and you'll notice that it's automatically highlighted. For instance, if I want to make a 50 millimeter line, it automatically dimensions that line. If I don't put in a number and I don't hit the dimension key, then it doesn't create that dimension. But let's say here that we wanted to make a 50 millimeter line. You see that it's automatically added. So now we have a fully defined line here. Let's go ahead and fix its endpoint. We have a defined line here, but its length is underdefined. And this one here is defined, but its angle is underdefined. So it's a great way that we quickly and easily make sketches and add those dimensions to it without having to do a bunch of extra clicks because it's already there. The only drawback is most people are right-handed and you have your mouse hand right next to the keyboard. So you're going to have to take your hand off the mouse, hit some numbers, and then go back to the mouse. That can be a little bit time consuming, but it's a great option because you don't have to use it. You can simply keep on sketching like you normally would.